My name is Dr. Haven Whitaker. I'm 36 years old and sitting alone in the back row of the ceremonial courtroom inside the William T. Harris Federal Courthouse in Chicago. My heels tap softly against the marble floor. As I settle into my seat, no one has reserved a place for me. That's fine. No one expected me to be here anyway. Up front, near the judge's bench, my family stands proudly in pressed suits, diamond earrings, and straight postures. My younger brother Ethan stands beside our father, preparing to be sworn into the Illinois bar, a newly minted attorney following in our father's footsteps, the favored son, the one who succeeded. A few rows ahead, I hear my mother whisper to someone, "We're just grateful one of our children found their path." My father, Henry Whitaker, a former state prosecutor who speaks as if every word is evidence, stands to give a brief pre-ceremony toast. He doesn't glance my way. Raising his glass, he says, "Justice isn't just about knowing the law, it's about upholding it. We're proud that at least one of our children never abandoned that responsibility." I don't flinch. After so many years, you learn to swallow words whole. They think I left Yale Law in shame, that I couldn't handle the pressure that I gave up. What they don't know, what they were never allowed to know, is that when I walked away, I was recruited into one of the most secretive branches of the Department of Justice. Now I lead investigations into federal corruption judges, senators, even former U.S. attorneys. I carry credentials that unlock sealed doors in Washington, D.C. I've helped dismantle bribery networks within courthouse walls. My job is to uncover corruption where others see legacy. My current assignment involves someone standing just a few feet from my family, but today none of that matters. I'm here as the unseen guest, the failed sister, the disappointment they mention with forced smiles and quick subject changes. The judge presiding over Ethan's ceremony is Martin Caldwell. To my family, he's an old friend, shared dinner stories and golf outings. To me, he's the focus of an ongoing investigation, offshore accounts, illicit campaign contributions, undisclosed conflicts of interest. When our eyes meet, the way he tenses tells me he knows exactly who I am. I lower my gaze, letting them enjoy their moment, letting them believe I'm the quiet one who couldn't keep up. For now, I used to walk the halls of Yale Law with a focus that made professors pause mid-lecture. First-year contracts, constitutional law, criminal procedure, I mastered them. I was the first to raise my hand, the last to leave study groups, the one classmates whispered about when grades were posted. Top 5% early clerkship offers even a faculty nomination for a prestigious legal fellowship. I didn't party, didn't date. I had a plan, keep my head down, stay focused, and one day maybe a U.S. attorney's office or even a judgeship. Then came Professor Langston, a name that still knots my stomach. Respected, published, untouchable. He also had a quiet reputation for helping certain students advance faster through vague mentorship arrangements. Most ignored it. But when I found a memo misplaced in a file, something about a cash payment tied to a federal clerkship recommendation, I couldn't ignore it. I found another one, too. I took it to the Internal Ethics Board thinking justice meant speaking up. Within days, my email access was cut off. A professor who once praised my appellate brief stopped acknowledging me in the hallway. Whispers began, then pitying looks. Then came the phone call, an unlisted number, a woman's calm, direct voice. She said she worked for a Department of Justice task force monitoring elite institutions, including mine. Someone observant, disciplined, unflinching like me might have value if I was willing to vanish from one world and enter another. The decision was quick. I withdrew from Yale a week later, no explanations, no appeal. My mother cried over the phone asking, "Are you pregnant?" as if that were the only reason to abandon such a promising life. My father didn't speak to me for weeks, and when he did, he said only, "You made your choice." By Christmas, the story was set. Haven failed, couldn't handle it, walked away. What they didn't know was that I was halfway through my DOJ clearance process, learning to track digital transfers across shell companies, training with agents who used code names and moved silently. They thought I quit because I was weak. I left because I saw something wrong, and someone handed me a badge. For 12 years, I've missed more Christmases than I've attended. I've sent gifts with no return address, replied to my mother's group texts with vague "hope it's warm in Chicago" messages, and quietly stepped back from every family tradition I once cherished. I always had an excuse: a work crisis, a colleague's emergency, a canceled flight. My family stopped asking questions. My cover story settled like dust on forgotten shelves. I worked at a small private forensic firm, low profile, unremarkable. My mother would sigh at brunches with friends. Haven lost her way. We don't talk about it much. My father, when asked by old colleagues what I did, would say administrative research in the private sector and pivot to Ethan's growing achievements. Meanwhile, I memorized 3 aliases, worked under 2 non-official cover identities, and spent more time in federal court basements than in my own apartment. I've interviewed judges whose names adorn courthouse plaques, traced wire transfers through 8 countries, and exposed bribery rings that nearly redirected election funds. Some days, I entered rooms wearing a wig, armed only with a legal pad and clearance that made security guards step aside. One Christmas Eve, I made it home for dinner wearing a burgundy sweater, smiling as if I hadn't spent the last 72 hours debriefing a whistleblower whose testimony would shake a congressional subcommittee. Ethan, 3 glasses of wine in and basking in praise from our uncle, leaned over and smirked. At least I passed the ethics bar exam. Everyone laughed, even our dad. I did too quietly while buttering a roll. I said nothing. 2 days earlier, I'd sat behind mirrored glass giving sworn testimony to a closed federal oversight panel on judicial misconduct. The hearing lasted 6 hours. My name will never be in the record. They think I'm quiet because I gave up. But I'm quiet because my work can't be named, and sometimes protecting the system means letting those inside it think you're nothing. Judge Martin Caldwell used to hand out candy canes to neighborhood kids at our family's Christmas parties. I remember his hearty laugh echoing through our living room, his hand resting comfortably on my father's shoulder like they were partners in a game, only they understood. Back then, I thought he looked like someone who belonged on a coin. Gray hair, commanding voice, a face built for trust. Now he's the central figure in Operation Silent Ledger. 3 months ago, our team started pulling threads from a buried audit tied to a lobbying firm in Virginia. The trail led to Caldwell, his wife's name on a Bahamas shell company, quarterly transfers from anonymous accounts, a real estate holding registered to a non-existent consulting firm. We mapped it, confirmed it, and 2 weeks ago I signed the summary for escalation. I didn't expect his name to appear on the ceremonial docket for Ethan's swearing in. I'd already declined the invitation, planning to work through the weekend, until I saw the docket in our internal database. There he was, Judge Martin T. Caldwell, officiating front and center. I raised it with Director Ellis during our Monday briefing. She looked up from the file, her voice even. "He'll recognize you. If he's smart, he won't say a word, but he might. She didn't tell me not to go. She never does. She lets us weigh the operational risk ourselves. But she added, 'You've worked 12 years in the shadows. Be ready if the lights turn on.' So, I booked a flight to Chicago, rented a car under a travel alias, packed plain clothing, nothing that screamed federal. I memorized Caldwell's body language under pressure, reviewed his public appearances over the past 12 months, calculated exposure risks, courtroom lobby post-event reception. I wasn't preparing for public embarrassment, but for the private kind, my father's eyes narrowing, my mother's hand tightening around her wine glass, Ethan staring like he didn't know me. Caldwell doesn't know I'll be there, and my family has no idea the man they're about to toast might be in handcuffs in 6 months because of me. The courtroom is packed with rows of navy suits, pearls and polished shoes, each family trying to look like they belong in the future their child is entering. I wear a simple black dress, hair pulled back, no makeup except concealer for the fatigue under my eyes. Nothing about me says federal, that's the point. I keep my eyes low, hands folded, not from shame, but from discipline. Ethan sits in the front row beside our father, who looks like he can barely contain his pride, adjusting his tie and whispering to Ethan probably courtroom anecdotes or advice. My mother, in her finest navy suit pearls gleaming, tilts her head slightly every time someone praises Ethan. Then papers shuffle, and Judge Martin Caldwell steps to the podium. He looks almost unchanged from the man I knew as a child, except now I see behind the smile. He begins his remarks congratulating the new attorneys, stressing the sacred weight of legal ethics. He's on autopilot, delivering a speech he could give in his sleep. But 2 minutes in his gaze drifts past the parents, the graduates, to the back toward me. His mouth pauses mid-sentence. A flicker of confusion crosses his face, then recognition. He hesitates just long enough for me to notice. I tilt my chin slightly, a subtle nod, no threat, just presence. But instead of recovering, he surprises us both. Clearing his throat, he looks across the courtroom and says, "Before we proceed, I'd like to acknowledge someone here today whose integrity changed the course of my career, though not in the way she might have intended." The room falls silent. Dr. Haven Whitaker, Senior Investigator, Department of Justice. The silence is immediate, absolute. Heads turn. My mother's neck stiffens. My father goes rigid. Ethan leans forward slightly as if confirming what he heard. Caldwell continues, his voice steady now. "Your investigation reminded me of something I'd forgotten to respect the law. For that, I thank you." My breath doesn't catch, but the courtroom's does. It doesn't matter that half the room doesn't understand. The title Senior Investigator DOJ says enough. For the first time in my adult life, my family looks at me not as a problem, but as a variable they hadn't considered. I don't smile, don't nod, just sit still, instincts cataloging every reaction. I prepared for many things, but not for being seen. The reception is held in a side room off the main lobby, lined with catered finger foods and subdued congratulations. The usual hum of professional chatter and family pride is quieter, like everyone's waiting to see who speaks first. I stand near the back, holding a ginger ale I haven't sipped, wearing the same calm that carried me through field interrogations, surveillance ops, and closed-door briefings. But this isn't federal protocol. This is family. No manual covers what to do when your father stares at you like you just stepped out of a classified file. Henry breaks the silence first, turning slowly from the dessert table, his voice low but clear. "DOJ, since when?" I meet his eyes. There's no point deflecting. "Since Yale. I was approached during the ethics investigation. I didn't drop out. I was recruited." His brow furrows, jaw tight, recalculating years of assumptions. My mother says nothing at first, her hand trembling as she adjusts her bracelet mouth slightly open. Then softly, "We thought you were lost." "I wasn't," I say. "I was doing what I was trained for, what I was cleared to do." For a moment, no one speaks. Then Ethan steps closer, his law school smugness replaced by curiosity, maybe awe. "That case last year with the DA's office, those sealed indictments, that was your team, wasn't it?" I don't answer directly. "The prosecutor on that case was flagged by our division 2 years ago. Let's just say you weren't arguing alone." His eyes widen. He leans back as if the room shifted. My father exhales slowly, like he's preparing a closing argument. "So, all these years we thought you gave up and you were running investigations into federal corruption." "That's the job," I say. "And the cover story. Standard protocol, minimal exposure, safer for everyone." My mother's voice cracks slightly. "Do you know how many nights I stayed up thinking you didn't know who you were?" "I knew exactly who I was," I say gently. "You just weren't allowed to. No one applauds, no one cries. But for the first time in years, no one looks past me. That's enough." Later that evening, after the reception thins and polite congratulations fade into stunned silences, I find myself at my parents' house. The rooms feel smaller than I remember. Familiar furniture, faded walls, somehow more fragile now that the air between us has shifted. My mother disappears upstairs without a word. When she returns, her heels silent on the carpet, she carries a cardboard box taped at the edges, yellowed with age. She sets it on the coffee table and kneels beside it, smoothing her hand over the lid before opening it. "I kept these," she says quietly. "I don't know why. I just couldn't throw them away." Inside is my old Yale Law ID badge, edges slightly bent, a worn folder labeled Haven Commendations, still sealed. I open it to find early letters from professors praise I never shared, notes about potential judicial clerkships I never pursued, and beneath it all a thin manila envelope. "This came last year," my mother says. "No return address. We weren't sure what it meant." I slide out the contents, a single-page DOJ certificate, vague by design, just a line at the bottom. "In recognition of service in matters of national integrity and judicial security." It's not the proof they might have once wanted, no title, no dates, but it's real, and now it's theirs. My father, silent by the fireplace, hands clasped behind him, stares at the envelope like it's a declassified file he's waited years to read. "You protected people like me," he says, finally. His voice isn't trembling, but something in it softens. "And I failed you." I say nothing. I don't need to. He steps closer, then closer still, and extends his hand not as a father, but as a man who understands serving something greater. "Thank you, Dr. Whitaker," I take his hand, and for the first time in years, I feel seen for who I am. The backyard smells the same freshly cut grass charcoal smoke, the sharp tang of lighter fluid my father insists on using no matter how often Ethan offers to upgrade the grill. It's the 4th of July, and the Whitakers are hosting as always. Folding chairs line the fence, flag-themed napkins flutter against paper plates. The small crowd includes neighbors, family, friends, and a few of my father's old colleagues, men with gray hair and stories starting with, "Back when I was in court." This time I don't arrive late, don't linger by the driveway, or wait for a text to draw me in. I walk through the side gate carrying a homemade peach cobbler, and I don't flinch when my father spots me across the yard. He straightens, not stiffly, but proudly. Turning to a small circle of retired attorneys, he says, "Gentlemen, this is my daughter, Haven DOJ." There's no hesitation in his voice, just fact. A simple introduction weighted in a way only men like them understand. No follow-up questions, just respectful nods, and that's enough. Ethan finds me later by the cooler, holding 2 plates piled high. He hands me one with a grin. "So you're the reason the DA panicked at closing." I raise an eyebrow, taking the plate. "I can't confirm or deny." He laughs. "We don't say more. We don't need to." The sky turns pink and someone lights the first sparkler. I'm no longer outside the circle. I'm in it on my own terms. For years, I let my family believe I walked away from everything I promised to be. I let them talk around my name at dinners, speak of me in hushed tones like a chapter that didn't turn out. I wore that silence like armor not because I didn't care, but because the job demanded it, because justice doesn't always wear robes or stand at podiums. Sometimes it sits quietly in the back of a courtroom watching. Sometimes it works through aliases, encrypted files, and closed-door briefings. Sometimes it looks like failure until the truth has room to speak. I didn't show up to prove anything to them. I showed up because that day mattered to my brother. I showed up because the people we become in silence deserve to exist in the light too. And even in families like mine, rooted in tradition, blind to nuance, there's room for truth, eventually. So, if your family has ever misjudged you, decided who you are without asking, don't spend your life proving them wrong. Live in a way that stays true and let time do the rest, because eventually the truth doesn't whisper, it stands up and is heard. If this story resonated with you, please like, comment, or subscribe to True Justice Stories. And remember, sometimes the quiet ones carry the most weight, and sometimes they're the ones holding it all together. Looking back, I've learned that silence can be a shield, but it's also a weight. My family's assumptions about my failure taught me that truth doesn't always need a stage to stand tall. It needs time and resolve. I spent years letting them believe I was less, not out of shame, but because my work demanded discretion. Justice, I've found, often moves quietly unnoticed until it's undeniable. The hardest lesson was accepting that their judgment didn't define me. My actions did. Living authentically, even in the shadows, builds a strength no one can take away. To anyone carrying a hidden truth, know this. You don't need to shout to be heard. Stay true, do the work, and let the results speak. Time will shift the narrative, and those who misjudged you will see you anew not because you proved them wrong, but because you lived right. The moment I stood in that courtroom seen for who I truly am, I realized the power of patience. Truth doesn't rush. It arrives when it's ready, and when it does, it changes everything.
Growing up as the youngest of 4 children in the Martinez family, I had always been viewed as the dreamer, the one with unrealistic expectations about money and success. While my older siblings had pursued traditional career paths, Elena became a nurse, Carlos joined the police force, and Maria worked in accounting, I had chosen a more unconventional route that my family consistently dismissed as financially irresponsible. To them, I was the 30-year-old who worked as a freelance financial consultant, lived in a modest apartment, and drove a reliable but unremarkable sedan. What they didn't understand was that my freelance consulting involved managing a diversified investment portfolio worth approximately $2.3 billion, including a controlling stake in Regional Community Bank, the institution that held the mortgages on every single property owned by my extended family. The bank acquisition had happened 3 years ago, during a period when Regional Community Bank was struggling with liquidity issues and regulatory compliance problems. Through a complex network of investment vehicles and holding companies, I had quietly purchased 68% of the bank's outstanding shares for $340 million. The transaction had been structured to keep my identity hidden from both the bank's management and its customers, including my family members who had been banking there for over 2 decades. The irony wasn't lost on me. Every month, when my parents made their mortgage payment, when Elena paid for her townhouse, when Carlos sent in his condo payment, and when Maria covered her suburban home loan, they were essentially paying rent to me. The bank they trusted with their financial futures was controlled by the family member they considered financially naive. This particular family gathering was taking place at my parents' house to celebrate my 30th birthday. The house itself, a comfortable 3-bedroom ranch in a middle-class neighborhood, was mortgaged through Regional Community Bank for $280,000. My parents had refinanced twice over the years, most recently to take advantage of lower interest rates that had been approved by loan officers who ultimately reported to me. "I've been thinking about your career situation," Dad announced as we sat down for dinner. 30 is a significant milestone. It's time to start thinking seriously about your financial future. "Dad's right," Elena added. "Freelance work is fine when you're in your 20s, but you need to think about stability and benefits now." I nodded politely and continued eating my birthday cake. There was no point in mentioning that my unstable freelance income had generated returns of $127 million in the previous fiscal year, or that my benefits package included ownership stakes in multiple financial institutions. "The problem with consulting work," Carlos said, "is that it's unpredictable. One month you might have several clients, the next month you could have nothing." "Exactly," Maria agreed. "You need to think about building equity and establishing credit. How are you supposed to qualify for a mortgage or car loan without steady employment?" The family nodded in agreement. This was familiar territory, my siblings offering practical advice to their younger brother who had clearly failed to grasp basic financial realities. "I've actually been looking at some opportunities," I said quietly. "What kind of opportunities?" Mom asked with interest. "There are some positions available at local banks and credit unions. Entry-level roles, but they offer good training programs and advancement potential." The family seemed encouraged by this development. Finally, their impractical brother was considering a sensible career in traditional financial services. "Banking is a solid field," Dad said approvingly. "People will always need financial services, and there's real opportunity for growth if you're willing to work hard." "Which banks are you considering?" Elena asked. "Regional Community Bank has some interesting openings," I replied. "They seem like a well-managed institution with strong community ties." Carlos nodded knowingly. "That's where we have our mortgage. They've always been professional and responsive. Good reputation in the community." "Regional Community is where all of U.S. Bank," Maria added. "They approved my home loan 2 years ago when some of the larger banks were being difficult about lending requirements." I smiled and took another bite of cake. It was true that Regional Community had approved Maria's loan, though she had no idea that the approval had come after I had specifically instructed the lending committee to prioritize her application despite some minor credit issues. "The important thing," Dad continued, "is that you're finally being realistic about your career options. This freelance consulting thing has gone on long enough." "Dad's right," Elena said. "You need to accept that not everyone is cut out for entrepreneurship or high-level business roles. There's nothing wrong with working for an established institution." The family murmured in agreement. They had spent years watching me pursue what they viewed as unrealistic financial goals, and they were relieved to see me finally considering a conventional career path. "Banking might actually suit your personality," Carlos said. "You've always been good with numbers and you understand how money works better than most people." "Thanks," I said. "I appreciate the encouragement." "Just remember," Maria added, "starting in an entry-level position means you'll need to prove yourself like everyone else. You can't expect special treatment just because you have some consulting experience." As dinner continued, the conversation moved to other topics, but the family kept returning to their favorite subject: my need to develop more realistic expectations about money and career success. They discussed their own financial milestones, Elena's recent refinancing, Carlos's plans to pay off his condo early, Maria's savings goals for her children's education. Throughout the conversation, I listened with interest as they described their relationships with Regional Community Bank. Elena praised the customer service representatives, Carlos appreciated the competitive interest rates, And Maria was grateful for the flexible lending policies that had made her home purchase possible. None of them realized they were describing the customer experience I had specifically designed when I acquired the bank. The competitive rates resulted from my decision to prioritize customer retention over short-term profit margins. The flexible lending policies reflected my instructions to focus on community development rather than strictly algorithmic underwriting. The excellent customer service was the result of staff training programs I had funded to differentiate regional community from larger, more impersonal institutions. The best part about regional community, Elena said, is that they really seem to care about their customers. It's not like dealing with some massive corporate bank where you're just an account number. That's exactly why community banks are so important, Dad agreed. They understand local needs and develop personal relationships with their customers. I nodded appreciatively. Dad was right about the importance of community banking, though he didn't realize he was explaining my own business philosophy back to me. Regional Community has been our family's bank for over 20 years, Mom added. They've helped us through refinancing home equity loans and even some difficult periods when money was tight. That kind of loyalty and customer service is rare these days, Carlos said. A lot of banks would have been much less flexible during tough times. As the evening progressed, the family became increasingly focused on what they viewed as my financial delusions and unrealistic expectations. Dad, in particular, seemed determined to deliver a reality check about money and career success. The thing you need to understand, Dad said, leaning forward in his chair, is that financial success requires discipline, patience, and realistic goal setting. You can't just dream about becoming wealthy. You have to work within the system and build wealth gradually. Dad's absolutely right, Elena said. Look at how we've all approached our finances. We bought houses we could afford, we make our mortgage payments on time, and we save money consistently. That's how you build real financial security. Exactly, Carlos added. Financial responsibility means living within your means and making smart, conservative decisions. Taking big risks or chasing unrealistic returns is how people get into serious trouble. The family nodded in agreement. They had all followed traditional financial advice: steady employment, manageable debt, conservative savings, and they had achieved comfortable middle-class lifestyles as a result. The problem with your consulting approach, Maria said, is that it's based on unrealistic expectations about how much money you can make. Real financial planning requires understanding market realities and accepting reasonable returns on investment. That's exactly right, Dad said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. You're financially delusional if you think you can just skip the normal steps and somehow become wealthy through consulting work. The family murmured their agreement. This was the intervention they had been planning. A direct confrontation with my unrealistic financial expectations and impractical career choices. Accept your reality and stop embarrassing us, Dad continued. You're 30 years old and you're still living like a college student. It's time to grow up and start building a real financial foundation. Everyone agreed I needed a reality check. Elena nodded sympathetically, Carlos looked concerned but supportive, and Maria seemed relieved that someone was finally addressing the elephant in the room. I nodded silently and continued eating my birthday cake. There was no point in arguing or defending my choices. The family had made their position clear, and they deserved to understand the consequences of their assumptions. You're right, I said simply. Dad seemed pleased with my response. The banking position at Regional Community could be exactly what you need. Steady income, professional development opportunities, and a chance to learn how real financial institutions operate. It would certainly be educational, I agreed. As the evening wound down, family members began clearing dishes and preparing to leave. The conversation had served its purpose. Everyone felt they had contributed to helping me understand the importance of financial realism and career stability. Think about what we discussed tonight, Dad said as I was getting ready to leave. This banking opportunity could be the start of a real career. I'll definitely consider it, I replied. Don't just consider it, Elena added. You need to take action and start building the kind of financial foundation that will support you long-term. Absolutely, I said. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the conversation. The family had been more direct than usual about their concerns, more explicit about their view that my financial expectations were unrealistic and embarrassing. They had invested significant emotional energy in what they believed was a necessary intervention. It was time for them to understand the actual reality of the situation. Monday morning, I called Regional Community Bank from my home office. "Good morning, this is calling regarding a comprehensive review of certain mortgage accounts," I said when the bank president answered. "Of course," he replied. "What specific accounts would you like us to review?" "I want a complete analysis of all mortgage terms for the Martinez family accounts," I said. "Elena Martinez, Carlos Martinez, Maria Santos and Robert and Carmen Martinez." "Understood. Any particular issues we should be looking for?" I considered the question carefully. All of the family mortgages were current and in good standing, but there were some interesting opportunities for policy adjustments that would help illustrate the relationship between financial reality and institutional control. "I want to review the interest rate structures, payment schedules, and any special accommodations that have been provided," I said. "Also prepare documentation showing how these accounts have been managed relative to our standard lending policies." "I'll have everything ready this afternoon." The analysis revealed what I had expected. Over the years, my family members had benefited from various accommodations and favorable terms that reflected my instructions to prioritize customer service and community relationships. Elena's mortgage had been approved despite some credit issues. Carlos had received interest rate reductions during a period of financial difficulty. Maria's loan terms had been adjusted to accommodate her income fluctuations. My parents had been approved for refinancing that might not have qualified under strictly algorithmic underwriting. All of these accommodations had been appropriate from a community banking perspective, but they also demonstrated how much my family's financial stability depended on the institution they took for granted. "I want to implement some policy adjustments," I told the bank president during our afternoon call. "Nothing inappropriate or punitive, but I think we should ensure that all customers are being treated according to our standard procedures." "What kind of adjustments are you thinking about?" "Interest rate reviews based on current market conditions, payment schedule optimizations, and compliance audits to ensure all accommodations are properly documented and justified." The president understood immediately. "Should we prioritize any particular accounts for this review process?" "Start with the Martinez family accounts," I said. "I want to make sure we're providing consistent professional service that reflects our institutional standards." The policy adjustments began Tuesday morning. Each family member received a letter from Regional Community Bank explaining that their mortgage terms were being reviewed as part of a comprehensive policy update designed to ensure consistent customer service and regulatory compliance. Elena called me Tuesday evening, sounding confused and concerned. "I got this weird letter from Regional Community Bank," she said. "They want to review my mortgage terms and payment schedule." "That sounds routine," I said. "Banks periodically review their loan portfolios to ensure everything is in compliance. But they're asking for updated financial documentation and suggesting that my interest rate might need to be adjusted based on current market conditions." I could hear papers rustling in the background as Elena reviewed the letter. "Did they give you any specific concerns about your account?" "They mentioned that some of the original loan terms reflected legacy accommodation policies that are being updated to ensure consistent treatment across all customer accounts." "That sounds like standard regulatory compliance language," I said. "Banks have to demonstrate that they're treating all customers fairly and consistently." "I guess so," Elena said, though she didn't sound convinced. "It's just strange timing. We've been banking with them for years without any issues." Carlos called Wednesday morning with similar concerns. "Regional Community sent me some kind of policy review notice," he said. "They want to schedule a meeting to discuss my mortgage terms." "What kind of meeting?" I asked. "Something about ensuring that all customers are receiving appropriate service levels and that loan terms reflect current market standards." "It sounds pretty serious." Carlos paused, then added, "The letter mentions that my account may have received certain accommodations that need to be reviewed and potentially adjusted." "Did they specify what accommodations they're referring to?" "Interest rate reductions during my financial difficulties a few years ago, and some flexibility with payment timing when I was between jobs. But those accommodations helped me keep the house. I thought they were just good customer service." "They probably were," I said. "But banks have to document everything carefully to prove they're not showing favoritism or discrimination." By Thursday, All 4 family members had received similar letters and were growing increasingly anxious about their mortgage situations. Maria called that evening, sounding particularly stressed. "This bank review is really worrying me," she said. "The letter suggests that my loan terms might not be available under current lending policies." "What does that mean practically?" I asked. "They're saying that if I were applying for the same loan today, I might not qualify for the same interest rate or payment structure. They want to normalize my account to reflect current standards." Maria's voice carried real concern. "If they increase my interest rate or change my payment schedule, I'm not sure I can afford the house anymore." "Have you talked to anyone at the bank directly?" I called the customer service number, but they just said this is a standard policy review and that I'll need to meet with a loan officer to discuss the details. By Friday morning, all 4 family members were dealing with mortgage reviews that could potentially affect their housing costs and financial stability. The accommodations and favorable terms they had received over the years were being scrutinized and potentially adjusted to reflect current market conditions and standard lending policies. Dad called Friday afternoon, his voice tense with worry and frustration. "Something's going on at Regional Community Bank," he said. "This isn't just a routine review. They're questioning every aspect of our mortgage terms." "What exactly are they telling you?" "That our refinancing terms from 3 years ago reflected legacy policies that may not be available under current guidelines. They want to adjust our interest rate to match what new customers would receive today." Dad paused, then continued, "The problem is that current rates are significantly higher than what we're paying now. If they force us to accept current market rates, our monthly payment could increase by $400 or $500. "That's a substantial change," I agreed. "We can't afford that kind of increase," Dad said. "We budgeted our retirement planning based on our current mortgage payment. If Regional Community forces us to accept higher rates, we might have to consider selling the house." The family spent the weekend frantically researching their options and trying to understand what had triggered Regional Community Bank's sudden interest in reviewing their accounts. They had all been model customers for years, making payments on time and maintaining good relationships with the bank staff. Elena called Saturday morning with an update. "I met with a loan officer yesterday," she said. "She was professional but not very encouraging about keeping my current terms." "What did she tell you?" "That the bank is implementing new policies to ensure all customers are treated consistently, and that some of the accommodations I received might not be available under current standards." Elena's voice carried genuine anxiety. "She suggested I might want to start shopping around with other lenders to see if I can find better terms elsewhere." "That seems like reasonable advice," I said. "But other banks are quoting rates that are even higher than what Regional Community is proposing. It seems like the whole lending market has changed." Carlos had a similar experience when he met with the bank Monday morning. "They're being very professional," he told me during his lunch break. "But it's clear they want to adjust my terms significantly." "What kind of adjustments?" "Higher interest rate, less flexible payment timing, and stricter income verification requirements going forward. The loan officer said these changes would bring my account into compliance with current institutional standards." Carlos sounded defeated. I asked if there was anything I could do to keep my current terms, but she said the policy review was being conducted at the executive level and loan officers didn't have discretion to override the new standards. Maria's meeting Tuesday afternoon was the most difficult. "They're essentially telling me that my loan wouldn't be approved under current policies," she called to report. "The combination of my income level and the loan amount doesn't meet their updated guidelines." "What does that mean for your situation?" "They're giving me 90 days to either find alternative financing or accept a significant increase in my interest rate and monthly payment. If I can't do either, they'll begin foreclosure proceedings." Maria's voice was strained with stress. "I've been banking with Regional Community for over a decade. I don't understand why they're suddenly treating me like a problem customer." By Wednesday, the entire family was in crisis mode. Dad called that evening for an emergency family conference call to discuss their collective situation with Regional Community Bank. "Something has changed at that bank," Dad said, his voice carrying both anger and anxiety. "Either they've been acquired by a larger institution with different policies, or there's some kind of regulatory pressure forcing them to review existing loans. Whatever the reason," Elena added, "we need to figure out our options quickly." If we all need to refinance elsewhere, we should coordinate our efforts. Carlos had done some research on alternative lenders. The problem is that current market rates are higher everywhere, he reported. Regional Community wasn't just being generous with our terms. The entire lending environment has become more restrictive. Which means we might not be able to replicate our current payments no matter where we go, Maria said. I might genuinely need to sell my house. The family spent an hour discussing potential strategies, but their options were limited. They had all become dependent on the favorable terms and accommodations provided by Regional Community Bank, and those benefits were now being systematically removed. I don't understand what triggered this, Dad said near the end of the call. We've been model customers for 20 years. Why would they suddenly decide to review all our accounts at the same time? It does seem like more than a coincidence, Elena agreed. 4 family members, all receiving review letters within the same week. Maybe someone filed a complaint about favoritism or discriminatory lending practices, Carlos suggested. Banks have to investigate those kinds of allegations very seriously. Thursday morning, I called Regional Community Bank again. I'd like an update on the Martinez family account reviews, I said when the president answered. The reviews are proceeding as scheduled, he replied. All 4 accounts are being adjusted to reflect current market standards and institutional policies. Any issues or complications with the process? The customer seemed surprised by some of the adjustments, but that's normal when people have been receiving favorable terms for extended periods. They've gotten used to accommodations that weren't sustainable long-term. I considered the situation carefully. The family had received exactly the reality check they had insisted I needed. They were learning firsthand how their financial stability depended on institutional relationships and market conditions beyond their control. I think we should continue with the standard adjustments, I said. But make sure all communications are professional and that customers understand their options. Understood. Should we provide any additional flexibility for these particular accounts? Treat them exactly like any other customers, I replied. No special accommodations but no unnecessary hardship either. Friday afternoon, Dad called with a final update on the family's situation. We've all received final notices from Regional Community Bank, he said. They're implementing the rate adjustments whether we like it or not. What did you decide to do? Elena and Carlos are going to try to refinance elsewhere, even though the rates won't be much better. Maria is putting her house on the market. Your mother and I are going to accept the higher payment and adjust our budget accordingly. Dad's voice carried resignation and frustration. 20 years of loyalty to that bank, and this is how they treat us when market conditions change. That must be very disappointing, I said. The worst part is feeling helpless, Dad continued. These institutions have so much power over people's lives, and there's nothing we can do when they decide to change their policies. It sounds like a difficult situation, I agreed. It really makes you understand how little control ordinary people have over their financial futures, Dad said. No matter how responsible you are, no matter how faithfully you make your payments, banks can change the rules whenever it suits their business interests. As the weeks passed, my family members adjusted to their new financial reality. Elena and Carlos successfully refinanced with other institutions, though their monthly payments increased by approximately $300 each. Maria sold her house and moved into a smaller apartment. My parents tightened their budget and accepted the higher mortgage payment, though they had to postpone some of their retirement plans. The experience had been sobering for all of them. They had learned that their comfortable middle-class lifestyles were more fragile than they had realized, dependent on institutional policies and market conditions that could change without warning. More importantly, they had gained a new perspective on financial risk and the relationship between individual circumstances and larger economic forces. The family members who had criticized my unrealistic financial expectations now understood how quickly their own supposedly stable situations could be disrupted. At Christmas dinner 3 months later, the conversation was markedly different from my birthday celebration. Instead of offering advice about financial responsibility and career stability, my family members seemed more focused on their own economic uncertainties. The mortgage situation really opened my eyes, Elena said during dinner. I thought I understood how banking worked, but I had no idea how vulnerable we all were to policy changes. It makes you realize how little control any of us actually have, Carlos added. We follow all the rules, make our payments on time, and then institutions can still change the terms whenever they want. Dad nodded grimly. The whole experience has given me a different perspective on financial security. What we thought was stability was really just temporary accommodation from people who could withdraw it at any time. I listened with interest as my family processed their new understanding of economic reality. They had learned important lessons about institutional power, market volatility, and the relationship between individual financial security and larger systemic forces. It's made me much more cautious about assuming that any financial arrangement is permanent, Maria said. Just because something has worked for years doesn't mean it will continue working. The family had also developed a new appreciation for the complexity of financial institutions and the various pressures they face from regulators, investors, and market conditions. I used to think banks were just service providers, Elena said. Now I understand their businesses with their own interests and constraints. As dinner concluded, Dad approached me privately. I want to apologize for some of the things I said at your birthday dinner, he said. I was pretty harsh about your financial situation. I appreciate that, I replied. This whole mortgage experience has given me a different perspective on financial risk and stability, Dad continued. I realized that my advice about taking safe, traditional approaches might not be as sound as I thought. Different strategies work for different people, I said. That's true. And I've been thinking that maybe your consulting approach gives you more flexibility and control than traditional employment would. Dad paused, then added, I still don't completely understand what you do or how you make money, but I've learned that I don't understand the financial system as well as I thought I did. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the events of the past several months. My family had gained valuable perspective on financial reality and institutional power, though the lessons had been more expensive than necessary. Regional Community Bank continued to operate successfully under my ownership, serving its community while maintaining appropriate professional standards. The irony, of course, was that my family still had no idea that their financial crisis had been orchestrated by the family member they had criticized for being financially delusional. But that was information for another day. Perhaps never. Some lessons were more valuable when people drew their own conclusions about financial security, institutional power, and the complex relationship between individual circumstances and larger economic forces. The important thing was that reality had been acknowledged, perspectives had been adjusted, and everyone had developed a more nuanced understanding of how financial systems actually worked. Everything else was just family dynamics. The text message came through while I was reviewing case files at my desk, the casual tone somehow making the betrayal worse. Marcus had sent it like he was doing me a favor, like decluttering my apartment was an act of brotherly kindness rather than theft. Sold your guitars for rent money. Got $3,500 total from the pawn shop on 5th Street. We'll pay you back eventually, but you know how tight things are right now. You had way too many anyway. Nobody needs 6 guitars just sitting around collecting dust. I stared at the message for a long moment, processing both the violation and the complete misunderstanding of what he'd just done. Those weren't just guitars sitting around my apartment. They were evidence in an ongoing federal investigation, protected assets that had been placed in my custody as part of a major organized crime case I'd been working for the past 18 months. My phone rang almost immediately. Mom's number. Emma, I heard Marcus had to sell some of your things, she said without preamble, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was about to defend one child at the expense of another. I know you're probably upset, but you have to understand how desperate he is right now. The eviction notice came yesterday and he's got nowhere else to turn. He stole my property and sold it, I said quietly, keeping my voice level. He borrowed some guitars that you weren't even using, she corrected. And it's not stealing when it's family. You know Marcus is going through a rough patch with the divorce and losing his job. The least you can do is help your brother when he's struggling. I listened to her explanation of Marcus's financial situation, the same story I'd been hearing for the past 6 months. The divorce had been expensive, his sales job had been eliminated during company restructuring, and he was 3 months behind on rent with no prospects for immediate employment. Besides, Mom continued, you have too many hobbies anyway. All those guitars and music equipment just sitting around your apartment like some kind of storage unit. At least now they're helping family instead of gathering dust. I understand, I replied, my standard response when family members made decisions about my life without consulting me. Marcus feels terrible about it, but what choice did he have? You never play them when we visit, and it's not like you're some kind of professional musician. He needed the money more than you needed 6 guitars cluttering up your space. After hanging up, I sat quietly for a few minutes, considering my options. The guitars weren't just personal property. They were evidence in a federal case involving a sophisticated art and antiquities smuggling ring that had been operating through high-end music stores across 3 states. The investigation had taken 2 years to develop, and those specific instruments contained hidden compartments that had been used to transport stolen artifacts worth millions of dollars. My official title was Financial Crimes Analyst with the FBI's Art Crime Team, though my family believed I worked as a data entry clerk for a small accounting firm. The misconception had started accidentally when I'd mentioned working with numbers and financial records, and I'd never bothered to correct their assumptions about my career. The Art Crime Team was a specialized unit that investigated cultural property crimes, art theft, and antiquities trafficking. My role involved analyzing financial transactions, tracking money flows, and identifying patterns in the illegal art market. It was detailed work that required security clearance and extensive background checks. Not exactly the kind of job my family associated with their perception of me as the underachieving sibling. Marcus had always been the golden child, the one with natural charisma and sales skills who could charm his way into any job. Even now, unemployed and facing eviction, the family rallied around him with support and excuses. Meanwhile, I was the quiet one who kept to herself, worked with computers, and apparently collected too many guitars for no apparent reason. What they didn't understand was that those guitars weren't mine to sell. They were evidence in United States versus Richardson, a case involving a network of dealers who had been smuggling stolen pre-Columbian artifacts inside vintage musical instruments. The guitars had been seized from various locations and were being held as evidence while we built our case against the smuggling ring. As the lead financial analyst on the case, I had been granted temporary custody of certain evidence items for detailed examination and analysis. The guitars contained sophisticated hidden compartments that we were studying to understand the full scope of the smuggling operation. Each instrument was tagged, cataloged, and legally protected under federal evidence protocols. Marcus had essentially stolen and sold federal evidence in an ongoing criminal investigation. My phone buzzed with another text from him. Pawn shop guy said they're probably worth more than what he paid, but he was doing me a solid by taking them all at once. Might be able to get a better price if you want to try somewhere else with the receipt. The casual tone suggested he had no idea what he'd actually done. To Marcus, they were just his sister's excessive guitar collection. To the federal government, they were protected evidence worth approximately $1.4 million in total, not for their value as musical instruments, but for their role in a major criminal investigation. I called my supervisor, Agent Sarah Rodriguez, to report the situation. Someone sold your evidence guitars? She repeated, her voice rising with disbelief. How is that even possible? They were in your secured custody. My brother had a key to my apartment for emergencies. He's facing eviction and thought he was helping himself to some unused guitars. This is a massive security breach. Those instruments are central to our case against the Richardson network. We need them back immediately. I know. I'm working on it. Working on it? This isn't something you work on. This is something you fix today. The U.S. Attorney's Office is going to lose their minds when they find out evidence in a federal case was sold to a pawn shop by your brother. Agent Rodriguez was right to be concerned. The guitars contained not just hidden compartments, but also microscopic traces of clay and other materials that linked them to specific archaeological sites. Our forensics team had spent months documenting every detail, and losing them could compromise the entire case. Which pawn shop? She asked. 5th Street Pawn, according to his text. I'm sending agents there now. Your brother is going to need a lawyer. The next few hours moved quickly. FBI agents arrived at 5th Street Pawn with a federal warrant, only to discover that 2 of the guitars had already been resold to private collectors. The pawn shop owner, Jerry Kowalski, was cooperative but clearly panicked when he realized he'd unknowingly received stolen federal evidence. The guy seemed legit, Jerry explained to the agents. Had ID, said they were his sister's guitars, just needed quick cash. Happens all the time. People sell family stuff when they're desperate. The agents explained that the guitars weren't stolen in the traditional sense. They were evidence in a federal investigation, which made their sale a serious federal crime regardless of Marcus's intentions or family relationship to me. By late afternoon, Agent Rodriguez called with an update. We recovered 4 of the 6 guitars from the pawn shop. 2 were sold this morning to collectors who are cooperating with the recovery. But your brother is in serious trouble, Chin. The U.S. attorney wants to press charges for theft of federal evidence, obstruction of justice, and interfering with a federal investigation. What kind of charges are we talking about? Federal felonies. Potentially 10 to 15 years if convicted on all counts. The value of the evidence and the impact on our investigation make this a major case. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. Marcus had no idea what he'd stepped into, and the family was going to blame me for his legal troubles once the truth came out. There might be options if he cooperates fully and if you're willing to vouch for his character, Rodriguez continued. But this can't be swept under the rug. Evidence security is taken very seriously at the bureau level. That evening Marcus called me directly. Emma, I need to talk to you about something serious. Some FBI agents showed up at my apartment asking about guitars I sold. They said they were evidence in some kind of federal case. What the hell is going on? His voice was shaking, the casual confidence from his morning text completely gone. You sold federal evidence in an ongoing criminal investigation, I said simply. What? How is that possible? They were just guitars in your apartment. They were evidence in my custody as part of my job. Your job? You work at an accounting firm doing data entry. No, Marcus. I'm a financial crimes analyst with the FBI's art crime team. Those guitars are evidence in a major smuggling case I've been working for 18 months. Silence stretched for nearly a minute. You work for the FBI? He finally asked. Art crime team, financial analysis division. The guitars contained hidden compartments used to smuggle stolen artifacts. They're worth $1.4 million as evidence, and you selling them is a federal crime. But I didn't know. You never told me you worked for the FBI. You never asked about my actual job. The family assumed I did data entry and I didn't bother correcting anyone. Marcus was quiet for a long time, processing the implications. What happens now? You need a lawyer. Federal prosecutors are considering charges for theft of federal evidence, obstruction of justice, and interfering with the federal investigation. These are serious felonies. How serious? 10 to 15 years in federal prison, potentially. I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line. Emma, you have to help me. Tell them it was a misunderstanding, that I didn't know what they were. You're my sister, you can't let them send me to prison for this. I can't make federal charges disappear, Marcus. You committed federal crimes. But I'm family. Doesn't that count for something? The conversation that followed was difficult. Marcus alternated between panic and anger, blaming me for not clearly labeling the guitars as evidence, for not telling the family about my real job, for not preventing him from making this mistake. It was everyone's fault except his own. 3 days later, the family held an emergency meeting at Mom and Dad's house. We need to discuss what's happening with Marcus, Dad announced grimly when everyone had gathered in the living room. This FBI situation is completely out of hand. Marcus sat slumped in his chair, looking like he hadn't slept since the agent's visit. Mom hovered nearby with tissues and reassuring touches, while Dad paced the room with barely contained anger. Emma, I need you to explain something to me, Dad said, stopping in front of my chair. How exactly did Marcus get in trouble for selling guitars? This whole story makes no sense. He sold federal evidence in an ongoing criminal investigation, I replied calmly. Evidence? They were guitars in your apartment. Personal property. They were evidence in my custody as part of my job with the FBI. Uncle Robert leaned forward in his chair. The FBI? You work for the FBI. Art crime team. I'm a financial crimes analyst specializing in cultural property crimes and antiquities trafficking. The room went silent as everyone processed this information. You work for the FBI, Mom repeated slowly, as if saying the words might make them make more sense. For the past 4 years. The guitars Marcus sold were evidence in a major smuggling case involving stolen artifacts worth millions of dollars. Dad sat down heavily. Why didn't you ever tell us you worked for the FBI? You all assumed I did data entry at an accounting firm. No one ever asked for details about my actual job responsibilities. Marcus looked up from his dejected posture. She's lying. This is some kind of story she made up to get me in trouble for selling her stupid guitars. I pulled out my FBI credentials and placed them on the coffee table. The federal badge and identification card clearly showed my name, photograph, and title with the bureau. Dad picked up the credentials with shaking hands. Financial Crimes Analyst, Art Crime Team, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The guitars contained hidden compartments used to smuggle pre-Columbian artifacts, I explained. They're evidence in United States versus Richardson, a case involving a network of dealers operating across 3 states. Selling them is a federal crime regardless of Marcus's intentions. But he's family, Mom protested. Surely that makes a difference. You can explain that it was an innocent mistake. Federal evidence protocols don't have exceptions for family members. Marcus committed federal crimes when he sold those guitars. Uncle Robert was staring at me with a mixture of shock and something that might have been respect. How long have you been working these kinds of cases? 4 years with the art crime team, 6 years total with the Bureau. I started in financial crimes before specializing in cultural property cases. The family meeting continued for another 2 hours, with everyone struggling to reconcile their perception of me as the underachieving sibling with the reality of my career in federal law enforcement. Dad asked detailed questions about my work, while Mom seemed unable to process that her quiet daughter had been investigating major criminal cases for years. Why keep it secret? Dad asked finally. I didn't keep it secret. I just never corrected your assumptions. You all decided I was unsuccessful based on my apartment, my car, my lifestyle. No one was interested in the details of my actual career. Marcus was becoming increasingly agitated as the conversation continued. This is all bullshit. Emma's trying to make herself look important while I'm facing federal prison. She could make this go away if she wanted to. No, Marcus. I can't make federal charges disappear. You committed serious crimes. They were just guitars. They were $1.4 million worth of federal evidence in a major criminal investigation. Agent Rodriguez called the next morning with an update on the case. The U.S. Attorney's Office is willing to consider a plea agreement, she reported. Full cooperation, restitution for investigation costs, and 5 years probation instead of prison time. But your brother has to admit guilt and provide complete testimony about his actions. What kind of restitution? Approximately $200,000 to cover the cost of recovering the evidence, re-authenticating the artifacts, and rebuilding the portions of our case that were compromised, plus court costs and administrative fees. I relayed this information to Marcus, who responded with a mixture of relief and outrage. $200,000? How am I supposed to pay that? I don't even have money for rent. It's better than 15 years in federal prison, I pointed out. Can't you help me with the money? You work for the FBI. You must make decent money. I'm not paying restitution for crimes you committed. But I'm your brother. And this is partly your fault for not telling me about your job. The conversation followed a familiar pattern, with Marcus alternating between self-pity and attempts to blame others for his situation. The possibility that he might face real consequences for his actions seemed incomprehensible to him. The family's reaction was similarly predictable. Dad thought the restitution amount was excessive, while Mom insisted there had to be some way to reduce the penalties for what she continued to describe as an innocent mistake. Maybe if Emma explained to her supervisors that Marcus is a good person who made an error in judgment, Mom suggested during another family call. The FBI doesn't reduce federal charges based on character references from family members, I explained patiently. But you have influence there. You could put in a good word for him. I have no influence over federal prosecution decisions. If anything, my connection to Marcus makes this case more complicated, not less. Over the following weeks, the family dynamics shifted as everyone adjusted to the new reality. Dad started asking questions about my work that showed genuine interest rather than dismissive assumptions. Mom struggled to understand how I'd hidden such a significant career for so long, while Uncle Robert seemed almost intimidated by the revelation. Marcus ultimately accepted the plea agreement, admitting guilt to federal charges in exchange for probation and restitution payments. The $200,000 fine would be paid through wage garnishment over 15 years, assuming he could maintain steady employment. The case resolution came 6 months later when the Richardson Network was convicted on multiple federal charges related to cultural property crimes. The evidence from the guitars had been crucial in establishing the scope of the smuggling operation and securing convictions against 12 defendants. Agent Rodriguez commended my professionalism throughout the investigation, despite the personal complications created by Marcus's actions. Not many agents could maintain objectivity when family members compromise their cases, she noted in my performance review. Your handling of the evidence security breach was exemplary. The family relationships continued to evolve gradually. Dad developed a genuine respect for my career achievements, often asking for details about cases I could discuss publicly. Mom remained somewhat bewildered by the disconnect between her perceptions and reality, but she stopped making assumptions about my financial situation or career prospects. Marcus served his probation successfully and eventually found steady employment, though our relationship remained strained. The restitution payments would continue for years, a constant reminder of the consequences of his actions. I still don't understand why you never told us about your real job, he said during one of our rare conversations. Because it didn't matter what you thought about my career. I didn't need your approval or recognition to be successful in federal law enforcement. But if I'd known, I never would have sold the guitars. If you'd asked before taking my property, you would have learned they weren't mine to sell. The most significant change was in how the family viewed success and achievement. No more assumptions based on lifestyle choices or visible wealth. No more lectures about career advancement from people who didn't understand the work involved. Most importantly, no more treating someone's property as available for family use without permission, regardless of apparent need or financial desperation. Federal law enforcement doesn't recognize family emergency exceptions, and $1.4 million worth of evidence isn't just guitars sitting around collecting dust. Some lessons come with permanent consequences, including federal felony convictions and 15 years of restitution payments.